Hello and welcome to this game review. So let's take a look. So it started as a reti and c4 was played by white, which is the usual way to pressure the center after developing the pieces. Usually black tries to defend the center, white plays queen b3 or pawn to b3 or take and then something, and usually the game goes on. And then here black took on c4, which is of course always possible to take the pawn, and the argument is usually that white will take some time to recapture the pawn, and meanwhile black usually tries to develop the queen side. But here white recaptures the pawn quite quickly, and after knight c6 and d4 we get some kind of Catalan position where the bishop on f5 is not necessarily very well placed. The knight on c6 is not very well placed as it is blocking the c-pawn, and if black doesn't get enough pressure on the center quickly, then white will eventually push the other pawn to e4, gaining a big center. So bishop e7, knight c3, rook d8, and rook d1 was played, which makes sense, but this is a little bit passive. The pawn on d4 is not really hanging, because even if we, for example, develop a piece or something, at the end of all this, white can just either take back one of the pawns, leaving black with a bad structure, or try to get the initiative in another way. So this pawn should not really be defended passively, and in general in chess, if we can, we shouldn't really defend passively. The engine suggests knight e5, and yeah, this pawn, if it is taken, white just gets a pawn back, and in a position such as this, even though white does not have his fianchettoed bishop anymore, this will not really be a problem for him long term, because he can always put his pawn on f3 and e4 to control the light squares and control this bishop as well. If the queens get exchanged, then the endgames will be quite fine for white, as there are quite a lot of weaknesses to attack. So instead rook d1, which is fine but a bit passive. Now black should have played knight a5 with the idea to play c5 as soon as possible and liberate his position. If he manages to do this, he will be more or less fine. But castles, now bishop f4, white gets very easy development, knight d5, and here white plays knight e5, exchanging the bad knight on c6, and usually we only play knight e5 if we have a concrete reason. If we're just trying to exchange the knights, then usually this is not a very good idea, but here after taking on e5, white concretely has to take back with the d-pawn, because now white will win a pawn due to the threat of e4, and already d5 is hanging. This opens up the rook, opens up the bishop. This bishop is badly placed, and white is doing very well here. But if we're trying to just take back with the bishop, then we have not really achieved much with knight e5, especially since the bishop will now be attacked, for example, with f6. And as mentioned in the comments, this is not necessarily too bad for white. Such positions are often played, but this is not a very good version, as black can quite easily try to play c5 to open up his dark squared bishop. Another plan is king h8, rook g8, and g5. So white does not really have the usual pressure here. So instead c6, c4, and now white gets this very big center. White definitely has the advantage, as all of his pieces are better placed. He has huge space. So this is a long-term advantage. And what do we do when we have a long-term advantage? We try not to change the position too much, as our advantage is in a static type. We should just try to improve the position as much as possible. And there are many small moves to improve the position, while black is not really having any counterplay. For example, if black plays c5, we'll usually respond with d5, creating a nice passed pawn. So white has moves such as a4, stopping b5, maybe playing a5 next, and rook b1, trying to maybe pressure the pawn on b7. Another idea is bishop f3 to play king g2, h4, h5, maybe try to get some kind of pressure on the king side as well. So white has a lot of these moves that are just slightly improving his position, while all of black's pieces are bad, and all of this points to white having a static advantage, and static advantages should not be treated dynamically like d5. d5 changes the whole position and doesn't really achieve much for white, as everything just gets exchanged and white's space advantage is completely gone. So this is quite an instructive moment for the white player. And queen c8 is played, but this just blunders a pawn, After queen f5, black has no real problems. He will play b6 or something, he will develop the rooks eventually, and only black can be better due to the weaknesses on the queen side. So a few moves later, now we get this endgame where white is a pawn ahead, and as they say, past pawns should be pushed. There's no reason not to play c4, but okay, bishop d4, and now white gets to ruin the structure further and also gets the d file for some reason, c4, and here bishop c6, but yeah, as mentioned, rook d7, the rook belongs in the 7th rank, there is no reason not to play this move. The bishop is not really hanging. Of course, we should be careful not to play something like king g2 because of rook b7 tactics, but we should assume that we're not really going to blunder anything. Bishop c6, and this is of course fine for white. Rook e1, but again, we should at least think about our opponent's moves a little bit, and after rook e1, if we're threatening rook e7, well then what about king f8, right? So we should have assumed that our opponent understands our idea. Of course, we should try to activate the rook somehow. Probably the b file is the best place. Let's not go here. Rook d2, rook b2 should be fine for white, because not only does he have a strong passed pawn and a good bishop, this is also a weakness, and if he picks up this pawn, he will easily be winning. So rook e1. Now black could have also improved his rook before white improves his own. But okay, king f8, rook d1. But this one just doesn't really make sense where the rook exactly is going. From d1 it can't really go anywhere. Actively d3 is covered, so we should at least play rook e3 to put our rook on a3 maybe, or b3. Because in every endgame, the rook activity is the first thing to think about. So rook d1, rook d2, f4, now the king arrives, and black gets to play a rook endgame, which can kind of help him get some chances, but rook endgames of course are also quite difficult. And here f5 should have been played, which is definitely not obvious. The point being that now after king d6 and taking the pawn endgame would not be losing for black, as in the game, because now after king e4, when white plays king f5, as he does, well, usually white's king would not have been allowed to play to e4 if the pawn was on f5. So now white is winning this rook endgame, but of course we still have to win the game. So we exchange this pawn, and now white should of course just take the pawn on f7. He has a 3-on-1 majority on the king side, which means that white should be able to create 2 connected passed pawns. This king is cut off, so this should be won 100 times out of 100, and even time pressure should not really be an excuse to lose this. So we should assume this is a win. Instead, rook e7, which of course does activate the rook, but this allows black his only kind of chance in this game, which is to take this pawn and try to promote this. If he doesn't do this, then there's absolutely nothing for black to do. We could just push the pawns and maybe create a passed pawn this way. This also should be winning enough, but this allows at least some hope. Now we lost the a2 pawn for no reason, but of course white is still completely winning. But now rook h6, rook h7, it's not clear what the point of this was. We should just probably improve our rook and just promote a pawn, as we already have the potential to create a passed pawn. There's no reason to take more pawns, as this just loses time. But okay, still white is winning because he can just sacrifice the rook. So f5, f6, and now f7 is hard to understand, as clearly black is threatening to promote the pawn first. So there's really no reason to allow this. Of course, rook a7 should be played. This is quite easy to understand. Then after f7, now black has promoted the pawn, and even if the black rook wasn't here, then why are we even getting into this kind of random race type of position when we could have just stopped the pawn? And we have more pawns, right? Which means we're winning most of the time. And so here, of course, black is just winning because he is a queen up. So quite an unfortunate ending. Such endgames shouldn't really be won. And with 22 seconds, I mean, we should try to think about candidate moves and what the opponent is threatening. Of course, panic sets in with such little time, but still, usually I would maybe advise playing with longer time controls if 22 seconds is not enough to make a good decision in such a positions, because of course intuition can only be developed once we play a lot of chess with longer time controls.